Peace. This is Jamal Robinson with 720astrology.com. Today's date is May 14th, 2024. At the time of recording this, it's 12:01 p.m. Central Standard Time. I want to welcome you to a new series that I'm starting, and it's called The Astrology of quote unquote Black People. So why do I say quote unquote Black people? Because as I go throughout this series, one of the things we will look at from an astrological background and perspective, tying into historical events, is the name Black or the label Black, as well as the other labels that have been levied upon this group of people who I identify with. This project, this series, I think is unique in that I don't think there's anything like it on the internet as far as I know of. And even if there is, it's unique because I'm going to give my own perspective and my own approach to how I'm going to delve into this and marry it with astrological events and aspects that form around key and significant moments in history. And I will be showing how the identity of the people who have been labeled as Black, Negro, colored, African American, who've had all these different brands, how these people have been changing and morphing, and how the world around them, the environment has changed, how the relationship within this landmass that is called the United States of America, how it has changed and morphed. And we're just gonna take an organic approach and see where the road goes. There will be no particular order that I'm going to follow with this when it comes to years, but I will start with the year 1987. And after 1987, we'll see where it goes in the next installment. But for this, our maiden voyage, we start with the year 1987. In 1987, I'm 10 years old. So I have vivid memories of that time. And I can still remember some of the things that were going on in 1987. But to set the stage, we have to give the astrological background and significance of this period. And it comes down to two planets. That's what we're going to focus on for this year of 1987, and it ties into 1988 as well. We're looking at Saturn and Uranus. Some people pronounce it Uranus. Saturn and Uranus in 1987 are moving very close together. They're actually already in range of being conjunct. Their conjunction was partile or perfect in 1988, 3 times: February, July, and October of 88, they were partile. But by 87, they are already moving close, and they are showing and indicating what they will be bringing about. And what we want to understand about outer planets, as Saturn and Uranus would be considered, because they move so slowly, their effects are not just immediate. as in like a Mercury or the sun or the moon, Mars, Venus. Those personal planets, the orbs are a little tighter because they move faster, and when they arrive at an aspect with a transit, their effects are more immediate because they are faster moving planets. The slower moving outer planets, we typically would use a larger orb, and that means the degree range that we will consider viable for a particular aspect. We'll use a larger orb because their power is much stronger because they move so slowly, and they tend to show their effects in waves, and they'll start giving indications before the actual aspect is perfect or partile, and they will continue to radiate beyond the partile aspect. So on both sides of the aspect, we will see, and those effects will be long lasting. We are still living in the effects of 1987, 1988. So what do Saturn and Uranus represent? Saturn, if we think about the mythology about Saturn and Uranus, Saturn would be Kronos in Greek mythology and the son of Uranus. And Saturn castrates his father, Uranus, and but from the castration, the semen goes into the ocean, and this is how it is said how Aphrodite, which is Venus, is fathered. But when we think about Kronos as time, we refer to Saturn or Kronos as father time. That mythology, that mythological story is showing us or demonstrating an archetypal attempt for what is fixed, what is established, what is tradition, to hold on, the attempt to hold on to those landmarks, those traditions, those foundations, to attempt to hold on to them at any cost. So Kronos castrating Uranus is an attempt to prevent the imminent change that the future always holds. One thing for certain is that change is going to happen. Change always happens. There's always an element of chaos. And Uranus, in many ways, represents eruptive, sudden, chaotic change. And Kronos, by castrating Uranus, is attempting to prevent that. So when we have these two planets that, amongst other things, represent these archetypal expressions, and they start coming together, there tend to be eruptive moments in history. And if we go back to 1987, leading into 88, we see where an old world is buttressed or juxtaposed to a new world. And those two don't particularly mesh. There's created some type of, there's a resistance, there is a roughness, there's a coarseness about Saturn attempting to blend with Uranus. Now, what's also interesting is that those two planets co-rule the sign of Aquarius, and Aquarius is the future. Aquarius is outside the box, but Aquarius holds both energies within because it is fixed after all. And the word fixed, we don't normally associate with Uranus. So the fixity of Aquarius is Saturnian, but the outside the box expression and thinking is Uranian. So Aquarius holds both energies within itself. It is conservative and a maverick at the same time. So we got these things bubbling, in 87. So here are some things that happened in 87 that demonstrated the old world meeting the new. Ronald Reagan gives a speech that is directed at then USSR, I guess you say prime minister or leader. And this was, see, Russia used to be part of the USSR, the Soviet Union. And at the time, Mikhail Gorbachev was the leader of the USSR. And so in 87, Reagan gives a speech and he says, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. Now, in that speech, he combined the elements of Saturn and Uranus because Saturn places limits and a wall serves as a limit. Uranus tears down limits, it encroaches borders. The Berlin Wall was built after World War II to separate East and West Germany. And so the USSR had control over the Berlin Wall. And so the then president's call to action was to initiate and act out the motifs of Saturn and Uranus conjoining each other, bringing the past up to now, and then saying there needs to be a breakthrough. Why? To lead to a new future. Now, Ronald Reagan was very active in 87 and 88, very active around this conjoining energy between Saturn and Uranus. And it is well known that his wife, Nancy Reagan, decided when he would deliver his speeches, decided when he would fly. All of his major speaking engagements, obligations, travel, everything was directed by astrology. And her astrologer was Joan Quigley. So nothing was chosen by happenstance. So in 87, Ronald Reagan also delivered his famous alien speech. What if all of our petty differences would soon be tossed aside if we had a greater threat than just ourselves? Now, that speech was very coded. And as we go along, I'm going to give my theory on what he meant by aliens, because a lot of things that happen in history in a given time, we think are completely disconnected from each other. And we think what may be going on in one sector has nothing to do with what's going on in a completely uh, in a sector that seems to completely have nothing to do with the other. But everything is being watched, everything is being surveilled, everything is noticed. And as we go back and review history, we find indications of such. He talks about aliens. Now, Uranus, along with Neptune, will deal with can bring into the thought process the concept of aliens. Uranus is more mechanical, as in the technology that would go beyond human conception or human understanding or human ability, which would be alien. Neptune, also dealing with aliens, would deal with the unbelievable aspect of alien, as in creatures or life forms or entities that are beyond the three-dimensional world. So both in different ways deal with the alien perspective. And side note, the conjunction between Saturn and Uranus is a pre-game warm-up for the conjunction that would happen about 6 years later between Uranus and Neptune. Very key, very key. So Reagan talks about the threat of a potential alien invasion. So in 1987, the same year, there is what we could say maybe is the official start, if we want to give it a year, a date, of the Afrocentric movement. And this is a key book that was published in 1987, Afrocentricity, Malefi Kediasanti. Okay. Well known, well known book for those who are in the Afrocentric circle. And this book attempts to explain the psychology behind this movement. And as I said, I remember living through this era. I was raised by a man who was very much Afrocentric. I learned about Afrocentric preachers, James Cone, Albert E. Cleage, um, Frazier. I can't remember his first name, but Frazier. I've got the books back here. So my father was very much into that. You know, back then this it was radical to think that Jesus was a black man. My father was a part of that thought process. Um, and so this all tied into the Afrocentricity, where even there was a need to make the religious orientation to have an Afrocentric foundation. This is something from the book. I'll just read a little bit in the break from this little subheading: breakdown and breakthrough strategies. I highlighted this because it has a very Oranian linguistic feel to it. Break, anything with break in it is Uranus. Break down, break through. So in that in itself, there's a challenge to the Saturnian established norm, a tradition. Well, there was an effort to buck the tradition, break down and break through strategies. The persistent agitation within Western societies that cannot be controlled is bringing on the breakdown of the last remnants of Western concepts held by people of African descent. And so he goes on and expounds on his viewpoint, and he gives, these different under the has these subheadings: break down. So he's saying break down your slave name. And the breakthrough would be to choose an African name. Break down defeatist notions. The breakthrough would be victorious thought. Break down the can't do attitudes. The breakthrough, confident attitudes. Break down love of other cultures first. The breakthrough, love of own culture first. So he goes on and on. And this book would serve as like a foundation into the journey into Afrocentricity. All right. The same year, 1987, the first Melanin conference is held by the Afrocentric community. So the term melanin is now circulating in the so-called Black Afro-American, African American community of intellectuals. Now this term melanin is surfacing, and there's this learning about what is melanin and what are the capabilities of it. Another book comes out, which is a very expensive book to get if you want to get it a physical copy now. It can run you hundreds to thousands of dollars to get a physical copy of this book. It's called Melanin, the Chemical Key to Black Greatness. The official copyright is 1988. So again, it is in this window, which means in 87, either it had to have been already written and was being edited, prepared for release, or it was in the final stages because it would be released the very next year. So there's this awakening of consciousness, not just about Afrocentricity, but also around, well, what is it within the Constitution chemically that makes us who we are? Now, from a metaphysical standpoint, and this is for another conversation, melanin is technically alien because melanin does not come from the three-dimensional world. Melanin is an interface between that which is beyond the three-dimensional world and the three-dimensional world. So if it does not come from the three-dimensional world, it would be considered an alien. 1987, Ronald Reagan gives a speech that says, "What if there was an alien threat?" And the average person would think that the two have nothing in common. In my hometown of Asheville, North Carolina, in 1987, I can remember a local church, Brown's Temple AME Zion Church, and AME stands for African Methodist Episcopal. Well, they had a preacher at that time named Leverett. I can't remember his first name, but Reverend Leverett. And what he instituted around this same time is this resurgence of Afrocentricity in the religion. So the congregation, the members there would don like kente cloth. The choir, they were known for the choir, like, back in the day you wore choir robes, where their choir robes would be some type of base color, and they would have the little kente cloth on the, I guess, the lapel or whatever running down. And so they were known for being an Afrocentric church. So I'm showing all this to show how the astrological aspect that's forming between Saturn and Uranus, which is an old world coming up against a new world, how it plays out in real time. And the other thing about Saturn is not just uh, disregarded in this, because what so-called Black people were trying to do was to go back and find a tradition that predated the tradition that had been given in an attempt to break free from the established tradition. So it was still a Saturnian effort. It was an attempt to try to go back to some foundation, Saturn. And then in going back to break free or break through the established norm, and that breaking through, breaking down and breaking through, that's Uranus. So you can see both, because in a conjunction, both energies are expressing at the same time. And so this is another way of showing how they were overlapping each other. The energetic fields were overlapping. In It just so happens that in 1987, while there is this emergence of Black African consciousness, that a new rap group appears on the West Coast, or they emerge on the West Coast. NWA. Maybe it's just happenstance or just coincidence, or maybe it is a coincidence, as in something that happens at the same time intentionally. So now we have, and as you know, NWA would help initiate a new type of hip hop, especially coming from the West Coast. And I remember sneaking to listen to this new type of expression. And how as a child with an active imagination, I'm trying to imagine what it's like in Compton. Like I'm learning about this place called Compton, LA. And I'm like, wow, I'm listening. And it's like, man, I'm thinking these guys gotta be the greatest gangsters that the world has ever known. Like, man, they probably just chew on nails and glass, like, man, they so hard. So they're out. The previous year, Cool G Rap debuts 1986. So around this energy, we see this Oranian type of music that is emerging around this, just kind of bubbling around this conjunction. Fuji Rap on the East Coast, the next year, NWA on the West Coast. Maybe it's just by happenstance. In 1987, Jesse Jackson is running for president. And in 1988, we have the actual the actual a president, new president is nominated, which would be George Bush Sr. would be the president and nominated in 88 after 8 years of Ronald Reagan. But Jesse Jackson served several purposes. He would help usher in a change. He would help usher in the change from being classified as Black to now African American. And it's interesting that as this name change occurs for these people who've been searching for an identity for so long, here's a new name that they're going to be called. That one of the key, and I remember how emotionally how I felt. First of all, the African American was just like in our house, it was just like, yeah, perfect. Cause we know we come from Africa and we were taught about our African history and pride in who we were. Cause, I grew up in a home where we were taught these things. And he introduced this mantra. Jesse Jackson is from Greenville, South Carolina. So he had this cadence when he would talk like a southern preacher. I am somebody. I am somebody. I remember like I am somebody. I am somebody. And it was like the same type of mantra that would be uttered 20 years later with Barack Obama's campaign. Yes, you can. And when you go back, yes, you can. I am somebody. And when you go back and think about how ambiguous both of these mantras were. Yes, you can what? Yes, you can. Think about it. The ambiguity of it, it's assumed that it's positive. But yes, you can run off the road. Yes, you can fall down the steps. Yes, you can run into a wall. So just as much as we assume that it means positive, there was no definitive given. I am somebody. Some is not definitive. Some is the root of the word something, something. I'm something. I'm somebody. Body means corpse. I'm some corpse. I have, and think about it. We caught into the emotional expression of re-identifying with who we are. And through the emotion, we get caught up in the mantra, I am somebody, because we think somebody means I have worth. When the word itself says I have no knowledge of who I am. I'm somebody, which means I'm anything, which can also mean I'm nothing. So here's the twist. Here's the twist in the story. That what if what we thought was radical back then was a game plan that was already orchestrated? Radical means root. So to be radical means to get to the root. Well, what if the root was GMO? I want to now refer to a document that cost me $40 to get. $40 to get this document. All right. This document comes from Oxford Journals, Oxford University Press, and the title of it is Changing Racial Labels from Colored to Negro to Black to African American. Now, I want to read some of this just to set the stage. And again, had to pay for this. This is not freely available online. So it's interesting how certain information is tucked behind paywalls but racial labels have been of special importance to Black Americans. Wrenched from their native lands, Blacks lost their core personal identities. Tribal affiliation, kinship ties, language, and many other cultural attributes were destroyed when Blacks were enslaved by an alien culture in a foreign land. Interesting. As Blacks gradually began to achieve emancipation or to gain ground under slavery, they forged a new culture and formed institutions and organizations to serve their needs and promote their interests. The effort was continually regulated by white society, which strictly controlled Blacks and sought to shape and regulate Black status and consciousness. Now, listen to this. I'm going to read this again. This effort was continuously regulated by white society, which strictly controlled Blacks and sought to shape and regulate Black status and consciousness. Now, this is mentioned in past tense, but just critical thinking. If a statement is made suggesting that a certain element of society has worked to control and shape and regulate Black status, quote unquote, Black status and consciousness, where is there any indication that it stopped? And who's to say that even what so called Black people were and are engaged in that appears to be revolutionary, radical, and so forth is not another representation of something being directed, regulated, shaped, and created by someone else? Moving on. So it begins by saying, in another section here, it says, while many different racial terms have been used throughout their history, the standard preferential term changed from colored in the 17th and early 20th century to Negro from then until the 1960s, then to Black, and now perhaps to African American. Now, here's the thing about this. This is very key. There's a footnote to this statement at the bottom. It says, colored, Negro, Black, and African were all established English terms for Blacks when America was first settled. African American was in use at least as early as the late 1700s. The alterations in racial labels that we are discussing thus represent changes in the acceptance of various labels, not the creation of new terms. This is key because every label, every nomenclature, every title has been in play since the beginning of the U.S. So the Afrocentricity movement was birthed from an idea that this reclamation of identity was bucking, breaking through, breaking down, and breaking free from an established system. When in the beginning of this document, it says that the name that was chosen in 1988 and led by one of the main leaders was Jesse Jackson. That name was already part of a milieu of proposed names early on. Why would you need to call an apple anything other than an apple? And why would the name need to change of an apple if apple already captures the essence of what it is? So critical thinking would lead one to question all of the names, the legitimacy of them, and to wonder if they were all part of a grander scheme. Continuing in another section, they're talking about the contention over the name Negro that was happening at the dawn of the 20th century. We're talking 1900s. Racial progress and the hopes and aspiration of blacks, especially as illustrated by Washington's self-help ideology, they're referring to Booker T. Washington, were to be captured by the term Negro, and old racial patterns in general and Southern racial traditions in particular were to be left behind with colored. Remember that. For a short spell, the term Negro occupied roughly the same place in Negro life as the words Black and Afro American occupy today. In other words, it was a term of militancy, self consciously used by Black men defiantly asserting their pride of race. Now, here's what's interesting. Negro supposedly was considered to be a form of defiance, to go against the established usage of color. But when you go back through history and look as early as 18th century, you'll see the term Negro being used quite often. And it's interesting that W.E.B. Du Bois was one of the major proponents of using the term Negro, according to this document. But he also is one of the key contributors to the founding of a well-known organization, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. A few organizations, most prominently the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, maintained colored in their titles while shifting to Negro for most other uses. Why would you need to call an apple anything other than an apple? Colored was virtually abandoned in naming of new organizations by the 1930s. Very interesting. Very interesting. Okay, so I want to shift back here to this section from Black to African American because now we're bringing it to the time period we're talking about. From the early 1970s to the late 1980s, the position of Black was virtually unchallenged. It was preferred by a large majority of Blacks, was used almost exclusively by Black organizations, and was virtually the only term for Blacks used in surveys. But then in December 1988, at a meeting of Black leaders in Chicago, Ramona H. Edelin, president of the National Urban Coalition, proposed that African American replace Black. This group endorsed the switch and launched a campaign in favor of African American that received wide attention. Jesse Jackson, as the group's spokesperson, announced, quote, just as we were called colored, but were not that, and then Negro, but were not that. To be called Black is just as baseless. Very interesting. Very interesting. We'll conclude by looking at a chart. This chart is set for November 18th, 1988, 2:35 p.m. Eastern Time, Washington, D.C. It is Ronald Reagan's remarks on the Drug Abuse Act of 1988. 87, he announces this alien threat. Maybe this alien threat has something to do with this whole melanin thing. And then in 1988, there's this Drug Abuse Act. And at 2:35 p.m., he comes out to talk about it. Let's pull up the chart for that moment in time and let's see what is happening in the sky. Okay, here we go. We got it. So, in electional astrology, when you want to elect a time to carry out an event or an action or to initiate something, one of the things you want to try to do is place on the horizon, I'm sorry, an energetic expression of what you look to accomplish. And hopefully it will be dignified. At the time that Reagan speaks, Aries is ascending in Washington, D.C., and Mars is in Aries. So Mars is dignified, and Mars is the god of war. At the same time, we have the sun in Scorpio. So there are hidden matters afoot at this time. And the modern ruler of Scorpio is in his domicile in Scorpio in the eighth house. So if there are hidden motives, if there are occult mechanisms at work here, then this energy helps to solidify the working of these occult matters. Additionally, the sun is in an out of sign trine to Mars. So they are both harmonized with each other to accomplish a goal. And if we think about it, this is part of the continued war on drugs. Mercury is there. So our thinking, there are hidden motives, there are subconscious workings. Our thinking is very mechanical. It is a dissecting thought process. It is not, because Scorpio deals with surgical knives. So we're looking to be very tactical with the operations. The sun is opposing Jupiter, Jupiter, which rules the ninth house of law. So Jupiter in the third is in position to be opposing the sun so that it can expand the operations of the sun, its activities in Scorpio. Something is afoot. Something is afoot. And we see our main aspect that we've been looking at is that we have Saturn and Uranus are in range. And Uranus is at 29 degrees of Sagittarius, the critical degree, meaning something's got to happen. It's at the critical degree in Sagittarius, the sign of law. And it's being received by Jupiter opposing the sun. So this law is going to serve to expand our activities, our occult activities, meaning there's something deeper going on. There's something hidden that we are concerned with. Mercury, we are thinking at a visceral, intestinal level. It's deep, it's hidden. It's also can be low vibrational thinking with Mercury in Scorpio. It can be deception. It's occult. It's hidden. but not just hidden as in you can't see it, hidden as in dealing with deep spiritual mechanisms, which over the decades, we've got volumes of information to demonstrate what melanin is, does, and is capable of. And it's not all good. Melanin is a master magnet. It can attract anything at an exponential level. And so maybe during this juncture in history, there was an effort put forward to refine kryptonite for Superman. Isn't it interesting that the same place that Superman comes from, Krypton, that his great albatross, the word Krypton is in it. Crypt, death. And in many schools of thought, melanin is crushed up death because it is the residue from primal worlds that pre-exist this one. And so how do you defeat Superman? With the same thing that makes him Superman. It's a lot to think about, a lot to ponder on. But this concludes our first installment of the astrology of Black people. I hope this has been edifying, and I hope that you all will share this. And I'm sure there'll be all different types of responses to this, but it's all good. But please share, please subscribe. And my hope is that soon this channel gets to 1,000 subscribers so I can start going live, because it's more enjoyable to go live than to pre-record these things. So subscribe, like, and share this video. Let's make it go viral. Private readings, I'm available through my website, 720astrology.com. Know the stars to know yourself. Peace.